The janitor's day always began before sunrise, when the military hospital was at its quietest and the halls echoed only with the hum of machines and distant footsteps of night nurses finishing their shifts. For nearly 12 years, he had followed the same routine without complaint. He pushed his cleaning cart through corridors others barely noticed, wiping floors that reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Few people knew his name, and fewer still asked. He preferred it that way. After a life once filled with noise, orders, and chaos, silence had become a kind of shelter. The hospital gave him steady work, anonymity, and the feeling that, in small ways, he was still useful. That morning felt no different at first. He signed in, nodded politely to the receptionist, and began cleaning near the main lobby. The hospital was preparing for an unexpected visit from a high-ranking general, which meant heightened security, restricted access, and an atmosphere thick with tension. Guards stood straighter, staff moved faster, and every unfamiliar face drew a second glance. The janitor noticed these changes but paid them little attention. He had seen many important people pass through these halls. Titles and ranks no longer impressed him. His focus remained on the floor beneath his feet and the steady rhythm of his work. As he moved closer to the private wing near the lobby, a sound reached him that made his hand freeze around the mop handle. It was faint, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to him it was unmistakable. A cough. Short, uneven, followed by a sharp intake of breath. His chest tightened. That sound carried him back years, to a dusty, broken city far from this polished hospital. To nights filled with smoke, sirens, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on every decision. He stood still, heart pounding, as the sound came again from behind a closed door down the corridor. For a moment he forgot where he was. His mind raced with memories he had locked away carefully. He remembered carrying someone much smaller than himself through debris, whispering reassurance while explosions echoed nearby. He remembered promising that no matter what happened, she would survive. That cough had haunted his dreams for years, and hearing it now felt impossible. Logic told him it could not be the same person. Yet instinct, sharpened by experiences that never truly fade, told him otherwise. He took an unconscious step toward the corridor, his cleaning cart rolling slightly behind him. That small movement did not go unnoticed. In a place governed by strict rules, any deviation during a high-level visit was suspect. A security officer called out to him, demanding to know where he was going. The janitor turned, startled, and tried to answer calmly. He explained that he was assigned to this area and was just finishing his route. His voice was quiet, steady, but lacked the authority that uniforms and rank provided. The guard's eyes narrowed. Another officer approached, questioning him more aggressively. Why was he lingering near restricted rooms? Why had he stopped working? The janitor tried to explain that he had heard something, that he believed someone might need help. His words came out awkwardly, burdened by years of silence and humility. To the guards, it sounded like an excuse. In a building where security protocols were absolute, intent mattered less than appearance. Hands grabbed his arms firmly. The janitor did not resist. Resistance had taught him painful lessons long ago. Instead, he turned his head toward the corridor one last time, searching for confirmation that he was not imagining things. His expression was not angry or afraid. It was urgent, filled with concern. That look meant nothing to the guards. To them, he was just another employee out of place at the wrong time. As they began pulling him away from the restricted area, whispers spread among nearby staff and visitors. Some watched with curiosity, others with discomfort. The janitor felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the knowledge that he was once again powerless to explain himself. He had accepted long ago that the world often judged by appearances. Still, something inside him resisted walking away. The promise he had made years ago echoed louder with every step they forced him to take. His mind replayed the past in fragments. He remembered choosing to leave a life of danger behind, not because he lacked courage, but because he had seen enough loss for one lifetime. When he returned home, he found that skills forged in crisis did not translate easily into civilian respect. The janitor's job was honest, simple, and invisible. It allowed him to exist without questions. Yet in that moment, the past he thought buried was standing just beyond a hospital door. The guards tightened their grip, urging him toward an exit. He lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but in concentration, listening intently. Then he heard it again. A voice this time, strained and emotional, speaking his name. It was faint but clear enough to stop his breath entirely. Before he could react, that voice grew louder, breaking through the controlled atmosphere of the lobby. Someone was running toward them, calling out urgently, and the sound carried with it a truth that could no longer be ignored. Part 2. The security officers continued pulling the janitor away, their focus fixed on procedure rather than possibility. To them he was a variable that did not belong, an unpredictable element during a high-level visit. One officer spoke into his radio, reporting a minor disturbance, using language that reduced the situation to protocol. The janitor listened quietly, aware that anything he said now would likely make things worse. He had learned long ago that authority rarely pauses to listen to those without visible status. Still, his attention remained anchored to the corridor behind them, where the sound had come from. His instincts told him that someone there was frightened, and instinct had once been the difference between life and death. As they reached the edge of the lobby, the janitor felt a surge of frustration not for himself but for what might happen if he were wrongfully removed. Hospitals were places of healing, yet fear and hierarchy could silence urgency. He remembered moments from his past when seconds mattered and hesitation cost lives. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on him now. He tried once more to speak, calmly explaining that he believed a patient might be in distress. His voice did not rise. It carried no accusation. It carried concern. The guards exchanged brief looks but did not stop. Their training emphasized control, not intuition. Nearby staff members watched the scene unfold with unease. Nurses paused mid-step, unsure whether to intervene. Patients in the waiting area sensed tension and fell quiet. The janitor felt exposed, his simple uniform suddenly a symbol of limitation. He wondered if this was how it would end, with him escorted out and the moment lost. He did not think of consequences for himself. He thought only of the promise he had made long ago to never ignore a call for help, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable it became. As they approached the security checkpoint, the general arrived in the lobby, flanked by officers and hospital administrators. His presence intensified the atmosphere instantly. Conversation stopped. Movements became precise. The janitor caught a glimpse of him from the corner of his eye, a man accustomed to command and unquestioned obedience. He did not expect the general to notice him. Men like that rarely noticed people like him. The guards straightened, eager to demonstrate control of the situation. Just as the officers prepared to escort the janitor out of the area, a sharp cry echoed through the lobby. It was not loud at first, but it carried raw emotion that cut through formality. A young woman's voice called out a name with urgency and fear. The janitor froze. He knew that voice as surely as he knew the sound of the cough. His heart pounded as the name was repeated, louder now, breaking the rigid order of the space. Heads turned. Security paused. The general stiffened, recognizing his daughter's voice instantly. She emerged from the corridor, pale and unsteady, pushing past a nurse who tried to stop her. Her eyes locked onto the janitor, and tears filled them as she rushed forward. She called his name again, her voice cracking, and reached out as if afraid he would disappear. The guards hesitated, confused by the sudden shift. No one had prepared them for this. The general stepped forward, demanding to know what was happening, his authority now challenged by concern for his child. The young woman spoke quickly, emotion spilling out as she explained that the janitor was not a threat. She said he was the man who had saved her years ago during a humanitarian mission in a conflict zone, long before her life was defined by titles and protection. She described being trapped under debris after an explosion, struggling to breathe, certain she would die. She told them how this man had found her, carried her through danger, and stayed awake for days to keep her alive. The janitor listened silently, his gaze lowered, uncomfortable with attention he never sought. The lobby fell into stunned silence as her words settled. The guards slowly released their grip, embarrassment, and uncertainty replacing certainty. The general listened without interruption, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief and finally to recognition. He looked at the janitor with new eyes, seeing not a maintenance worker but a man connected to his family's past in ways no briefing had ever mentioned. The janitor finally spoke, not to defend himself, but to reassure the young woman. He told her she was safe and that he was glad she had survived. His voice was calm, steady, unchanged by the sudden reversal of power. That composure spoke louder than any explanation. In that moment, the rigid lines between rank and role blurred, replaced by something more human. The general nodded slowly, understanding that authority does not always wear the uniform people expect. What had begun as a routine security response had transformed into a confrontation with truth. The hospital, for a brief moment, became more than a place of rules and hierarchy. It became a place where unseen history surfaced, where quiet service was acknowledged, and where the assumption that importance can be judged by appearance was finally challenged. Part 3. The young woman's voice continued to echo in the lobby as she stood between the janitor and the security officers, her hands shaking but her stance firm. She took a breath and began explaining more clearly, as if afraid that silence might erase the truth again. She spoke of a time when her life had been reduced to survival, when titles and protection meant nothing. During a humanitarian visit years earlier, her convoy had been caught in an unexpected attack. Chaos had erupted within seconds, and she had been separated from her team, trapped beneath collapsed concrete and twisted metal. Panic and smoke had filled her lungs, and every attempt to call for help had faded into weakness. She remembered thinking that no one would find her in time. She looked at the janitor as she spoke, her eyes filled with gratitude rather than drama. She described how he had appeared through the dust, calm and focused, ignoring danger to reach her. He had spoken to her steadily, telling her to stay awake, to breathe slowly, to hold on. He had lifted her with care and carried her through rubble, while explosions echoed nearby. For days afterward, he stayed close, checking on her even when others had moved on. He never asked who she was or why she was there. To him, she had simply been someone who needed help. The janitor listened quietly, hands folded in front of him, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. He had not thought of those events as heroic. At the time, they had felt like the only reasonable actions available. He had been trained to respond to crisis, to protect life without asking questions. When the mission ended, he returned home without recognition, carrying memories he rarely shared. Civilian life had been difficult, and anonymity had become his refuge. He never imagined that the past would resurface in such a public way. The general stepped closer, his authoritative presence now softened by emotion. He asked his daughter gentle questions, confirming details he remembered only vaguely from reports and briefings. As she answered, his posture changed. The rigid stance of command gave way to something more personal. He turned to the janitor and asked why he had never come forward. The janitor answered simply that he had done his duty and moved on. Recognition had never been his goal. Survival had been enough. Around them, hospital staff and security officers listened in silence. The guards who had detained him stood awkwardly, realizing how narrowly their assumptions had missed the truth. Procedures that once felt unshakable now seemed fragile in the face of lived experience. The general addressed them firmly but without anger, reminding them that security exists to protect people, not to erase their humanity. His words carried weight, not as a reprimand but as a lesson. The young woman reached for the janitor's hand, thanking him again, this time more softly. She told him that seeing him there had brought back memories she had never fully processed. Even surrounded by protection, she had never forgotten the man who treated her not as a responsibility or a symbol, but as a life worth saving. The janitor nodded, assuring her that she had grown strong and capable. He spoke to her as he would to anyone he cared about, without reverence or fear. The general insisted that the janitor be treated with respect and invited him to sit while they talked. The offer was polite, sincere, and unfamiliar. The janitor accepted, not out of pride but out of understanding that refusing might diminish the moment's meaning. As they spoke, it became clear that this encounter was not about praise, but acknowledgement. The general expressed gratitude not only for saving his daughter, but for the humility with which the janitor had carried that act forward into a quiet life of service. When the conversation ended, the lobby slowly returned to its rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. Staff members exchanged thoughtful glances, reminded that every person in the building carried unseen history. The janitor was offered recognition and assistance, but he declined anything that would change his life drastically. He asked only to return to his work. Cleaning, he said, gave him peace. Later that day, as he pushed his cart through the familiar corridors, he felt lighter. Not because he had been praised, but because the truth had been spoken aloud. The young woman watched him go, understanding that some heroes do not need uniforms or medals. They choose to serve quietly, and when their moment comes, their actions speak for them. Part 4. The hours that followed, the atmosphere inside the hospital shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Word of what had happened spread quietly among staff, not as gossip, but as reflection. People who had passed the janitor every day without a second glance now noticed him differently, not with awe, but with respect. The general remained at the hospital longer than planned, speaking privately with administrators about procedures and reminding them that safety must never come at the cost of dignity. His presence was still authoritative, but it carried humility shaped by gratitude rather than command. True to his character, the janitor asked for nothing. When offered formal recognition and public acknowledgement, he declined politely. He explained that he had not acted for praise then, and he did not need it now. What mattered to him was that the young woman was alive and thriving. He returned to his routine, finishing his shift with the same care he always had, wiping surfaces and emptying bins as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet for him, something had changed internally. The burden of carrying his past alone felt lighter now that it had been acknowledged, even briefly. The general's daughter recovered quickly and requested a private meeting with the janitor before leaving the hospital. She thanked him once more, not with dramatic words, but with sincere appreciation. She spoke about how his calm presence during the worst moments of her life had shaped her understanding of strength. It was not loud or aggressive, but steady and compassionate. The janitor listened, humbled, and reminded her that resilience grows when people are willing to support one another without expectation. Their exchange was quiet, personal, and free from ceremony. In the days that followed, the general ensured that the janitor's service record was properly documented, though not publicized. It was important to him that integrity be honored without turning it into spectacle. The hospital updated its security training to emphasize awareness and respectful engagement with all staff, regardless of role or appearance. It was a small change, but a meaningful one. Authority, they learned, is strongest when paired with understanding. The janitor's life returned to its familiar rhythm. He continued to arrive before dawn, moving through the halls with practiced ease. Yet interactions changed. Staff greeted him by name. Nurses paused to ask how he was doing. These gestures were simple, but they mattered. He did not seek attention, but he accepted kindness when it was offered. His work remained the same, but his presence was no longer invisible. At home, he reflected on the strange way life brings closure when least expected. He had spent years believing that his past was something to hide, something that did not belong in his present. That day had shown him otherwise. Service, he realized, is not defined by recognition, but by continuity. He had never stopped serving, only changed how he did it. The general's daughter carried the lesson forward as well. She became more involved in humanitarian work, choosing to engage directly rather than from a distance. She understood now that true protection comes not only from power, but from people willing to act with courage and compassion. The janitor remained a quiet influence in her life, a reminder that character reveals itself in moments of crisis and in everyday consistency. The story of that day never became public knowledge, and that was exactly how the janitor preferred it. It lived on in changed attitudes, improved practices, and a deeper understanding shared by those who witnessed it. In a place defined by hierarchy and control, a quiet man with a mop had reminded everyone that humanity must always come first.